On December 12, 1942, during the 303rd Bombardment Group's 6th combat mission of the war, Lieutenant Paul Frank Flickinger of the United States Army Air Forces guided his crippled bomber through the hostile skies of occupied France. Below him, the frosted landscape of a French winter offered no sanctuary. His aircraft, a Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress, serial number 4124585, was dying. Part of the 360th Bombardment Squadron of the 303rd Bombardment Group, a unit known as Hell's Angels, the bomber bore the unofficial name Wulfe Hound, hand-painted on its nose by the ground crew back at RAF Molesworth in England. Just hours earlier, it had taken off as one of 20 bombers on mission number 25, targeting the vital railroad marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville. The mission began as a brutal education. The still green crews of the 303rd, thrust into the crucible of the air war over Europe, found themselves swarmed by the hardened veterans of the Luftwaffe. Focke-Wulf FW-19 fighters, the infamous Butcher Birds, tore into the American formation with disciplined fury. For the crew of Wulfe Hound, the abstract terror of aerial combat became a sudden, violent reality. Cannon shells and machine gun fire ripped through the bomber's aluminum skin. One of its 4 massive Wright Cyclone engines sputtered, coughed black smoke, and died, its propeller windmilling uselessly against the frigid air. A second engine began to lose power, trailing a telltale plume of smoke that signaled catastrophic damage. Flickinger wrestled with the controls, fighting to keep the heavy bomber level as it bled altitude and speed. The disciplined geometry of the American combat box, their only real defense, began to pull away. The other B-17s, unable to slow without making themselves vulnerable, became distant specks, continuing their desperate flight toward the safety of the English Channel. For Wulfe Hound, the formation's protective umbrella of interlocking machine gun fire was gone. They were alone, crippled, and deep inside enemy territory. The choices facing Flickinger were a triad of certain death. Turning back toward England was suicide. A damaged bomber lagging behind the formation was a T-bone steak for the swarming German fighters. A desperate run for neutral Switzerland or Sweden meant hundreds of miles over hostile ground with failing engines and a sky full of predators. Only one option offered his 10-man crew a sliver of a chance at survival: an immediate emergency landing. Through breaks in the clouds, Flickinger spotted what appeared to be a suitable field near Provence, France. With a skill that defied the chaos engulfing his cockpit, he brought the massive 30-ton bomber down. There was no runway, only a muddy hayfield. He opted for a wheels-up landing, a violent but controlled crash. The B-17 slammed into the soft earth, its ball turret guns pointing downward, acting as a plow, carving a long, deep furrow in the French soil before the shuddering airframe finally skidded to a halt. The 10-man crew emerged, hands raised, expecting the grim but predictable fate of prisoners of war. As German soldiers swarmed the field, the crew scrambled to enact their final duty: destroy the aircraft. They stuffed a parachute into a fuel tank, preparing to fire a very pistol flare into the volatile mix. But they were too slow. The German soldiers were upon them, stopping the act of sabotage before the flare could be fired. In that moment, Paul Flickinger and his men could not have known the true gravity of their failure. While some crew members, including navigator First Lieutenant Gilbert Showalter and co-pilot Second Lieutenant Jack Williams, would successfully evade capture, Flickinger would become a prisoner of war. He had just handed the German Luftwaffe its most valuable intelligence prize of the entire air war, the first completely intact, flyable Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. For Flickinger, the weight of this event would become a personal burden. He would later recall that he always felt guilty seeing pictures of his bomber in Luftwaffe markings, knowing his was the first. Within hours, the captured fortress was the center of an intense, high-priority operation. Luftwaffe ground crews and engineers descended upon the French field, treating the downed bomber not as a wreck, but as a sacred artifact. Every system, every structural detail, every piece of technology was photographed and documented before souvenir hunters or saboteurs could inflict further damage. Most Allied aircraft arrived in Germany as scattered fragments, their secrets buried in twisted metal. But Wulfe Hound sat nearly whole, a complete textbook of American heavy bomber technology, ready to be read. German recovery specialists immediately understood the magnitude of their prize. The damaged but repairable bomber was carefully dismantled and transported to the major Luftwaffe base at Leeuwarden Airfield in the Netherlands for repair. There, German mechanics began the meticulous process of resurrection. Using salvaged components, they patched the battle damage and restored the aircraft systems to working order. However, the heavily damaged ball turret, which had dug into the French field on landing, was deemed irreparable and was never replaced, leaving a conspicuous gap in the bomber's otherwise comprehensive defensive armor. By March of 1943, the transformation was complete. The familiar olive drab of the USAAF was gone, replaced by a new alien identity. German national insignia, the stark black Balkenkreuz, now adorned the wings and fuselage. A swastika was painted on the tail. The aircraft's undersurfaces were painted a bright, conspicuous yellow, a clear warning to German anti-aircraft gunners. It was assigned a new German identification code, a Stammkennzeichen, DL+XC. Wulfe Hound was no more. In its place was a ghost, a perfect copy of an American bomber now in service to the Third Reich. On March 17, 1943, 3 months after its capture, the resurrected bomber took to the skies for the first time under German control. A hand-picked Luftwaffe crew, under the command of a pilot named Flugzeugführer Böttcher, climbed aboard for the perilous ferry flight to the heart of the German war machine's technical intelligence apparatus, the Luftwaffe Test and Evaluation Center, at Rechlin Lars Airfield, approximately 50 miles north of Berlin. 2 Messerschmitt Bf-110 heavy fighters took up position as escorts. The flight plan was a document of extreme importance, distributed to every Luftwaffe fighter base and flak battery along the route, with explicit capitalized instructions not to engage the captured fortress. Despite these precautions, the journey was not without incident. The sight of a B-17 flying deep over German-controlled territory was an irresistible target. At one point, nervous and eager German gunners, their recognition skills failing them, opened fire on their own prize, inflicting minor additional damage before frantic signals could confirm the bomber's new allegiance. This incident was a telling symptom of a military organization beginning to feel the immense strain of a multi-front war, its command structures fracturing under the pressure. When the B-17 with the black crosses finally touched down at Rechlin, it entered a world dedicated to the systematic deconstruction of enemy technology. Rechlin was the German equivalent of the United States Wright Field or Britain's Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. It was a secretive, sprawling campus of airstrips, hangars, and laboratories, staffed by hundreds of Germany's finest engineers, technicians, and test pilots. Their singular mission was to take captured enemy aircraft, rebuild them, fly them, and tear them apart,
searching for any weakness to exploit, any innovation to copy, and any secret that could be turned against its creators. For the next several months, Wulfe Hound would remain grounded as it gave up those secrets under the relentless scrutiny of German specialists. The teams of German engineers who descended upon Wulfe Hound were industrial archaeologists, peeling back the layers of a foreign technology that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. They removed panels to study the structural design, marveling at the sophisticated stressed skin construction that gave the B-17 its legendary toughness. They measured the thickness of the aluminum skin, analyzed the composition of its alloys, and tested the patterns of its rivets. Every system was meticulously documented. The electrical network, with its miles of neatly organized wiring, revealed an American approach to systems integration that prioritized reliability and ease of maintenance. The hydraulic controls showcased sophisticated valve designs and pressure regulation. The oxygen distribution system demonstrated a mature understanding of the challenges of high-altitude operations, a field where American bomber crews were pushing the boundaries of human endurance. Of particular interest was the famed Norden bomb sight. This was a piece of technology so secret that bomber crews were under orders to destroy it with thermite grenades before capture. The Germans had already acquired the plans for the Norden years earlier through a spy, Hermann Lang, who worked at the Norden factory. But having a working model to dissect was an intelligence coup. Yet, after extensive analysis, German engineers came to a surprising and satisfying conclusion. Their own Luftwaffe 7 bomb sight was, in many respects, superior. While the Norden was a brilliant piece of engineering, it required a long, straight, and level bombing run to function correctly, making the bomber predictable and vulnerable. The Luftwaffe 7, by contrast, was mechanically simpler and allowed for more tactical flexibility during the final approach to the target. It was a small but significant boost to German morale, a confirmation that in some areas their own technology still held the edge. But this single victory was overshadowed by a far more disturbing revelation. What truly began to emerge from the study of Wulfe Hound was not just a picture of an aircraft, but a portrait of the industrial philosophy that had created it. The Luftwaffe's aeronautical engineers were struck by the evidence of mass production on a scale German industry had never achieved. Standardized components were everywhere, meaning parts manufactured in different factories across the vast expanse of the United States would fit together seamlessly. This concept of interchangeable parts allowed damaged components to be swapped out quickly under field conditions, a logistical advantage that the Germans, with their reliance on custom-fitted parts, could not match.
They noted simplified assembly sequences that reduced the skill level required for workers, allowing a less trained labor force to build incredibly complex aircraft. This discovery at Rechlin exposed a fundamental and ultimately fatal chasm between the two nations' approaches to warfare. German industry, for all its engineering brilliance, operated on a philosophy of artisanship. Their aircraft, like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190, were masterpieces of design, but they required skilled craftsmen to build. Components were often hand-fitted, panels were meticulously shaped, and assembly was a labor-intensive process that valued perfection over volume. This approach produced superb fighting machines, but it was the methodology of a fine watchmaker, not a global industrial power. It could not be scaled up to meet the insatiable demands of a total war of attrition. Furthermore, as the war progressed,
German production quality began to suffer. Allied bombing raids relentlessly targeted factories, disrupting supply chains and destroying critical tooling. The increasing reliance on slave labor, workers who were brutalized, starved, and had no investment in the quality of their work, led to rough workmanship, mismatched panels, and improvised repairs. The B-17, in stark contrast, was the product of a completely different worldview, a philosophy forged in the automobile factories of Detroit. It was a philosophy of mass production which prioritized volume, standardization, and efficiency above all else. Every design decision reflected this. The use of standardized fasteners reduced inventory and simplified assembly. The preference for straight panels with minimal compound curves made forming the aluminum skin faster and cheaper. The most revolutionary concept was modular construction. The B-17 was not built as a single unit from the ground up. Instead, different factories across the country would build entire sub-assemblies, a fuselage section in one state, a wing in another, a tail assembly in a third. These modules were then shipped to a final assembly plant where they would fit together with remarkable precision, thanks to the use of complex jigs and fixtures that ensured every part was identical. This system allowed for a parallel construction process that dramatically reduced the time it took to build a single bomber from weeks to mere hours. It was a system designed to be run by a semi-skilled workforce, including hundreds of thousands of women who had entered the industrial labor force for the first time. The B-17 did not represent a single piece of clever engineering. It represented an entire industrial ecosystem, an arsenal of democracy that Germany simply could not comprehend, let alone match. While the engineers dissected its anatomy, the Luftwaffe's most experienced test pilots prepared to understand its soul. Hans-Werner Lerche, a man who would become the most experienced German test pilot of captured Allied aircraft during the war, approached the task with a scientist's curiosity. Possessing an engineering background and exceptional natural flying ability, Lerche was perfectly suited for the dangerous work of flying enemy aircraft without instruction manuals, checklists, or qualified instructors. He learned by observation and experimentation, carefully testing his assumptions at altitude where mistakes were less likely to be fatal. Climbing into the B-17's cockpit for the first time, German pilots like Lerche entered a different world. The instrument layout followed a different philosophy, with centralized panels and standardized gauge positions designed to allow pilots to transition between different aircraft types with ease. They noted the use of circuit breakers instead of fuses in the electrical system, a small detail that greatly simplified troubleshooting. They had to adapt to different pressure scales calibrated in pounds per square inch and a throttle quadrant that operated with reversed logic compared to German aircraft, where forward motion increased power rather than decreasing it. This difference in cockpit design philosophy was a point of contention. Some German pilots, like Walter Wolfram, found the complexity of American cockpits disconcerting, arguing that the simple, intuitive layout of a German Bf-109 allowed a pilot to fit like a hand in a glove, freeing his mind to focus on combat. But what truly astounded them was the aircraft's performance in the air. American pilots had consistently praised the B-17's forgiving flight characteristics, and the German test pilots quickly confirmed these assessments. The Fortress, weighing up to 30 tons fully loaded, flew with surprising stability and responded to control inputs with a docility that belied its immense size. In a series of grueling tests, they deliberately shut down one and then two engines. To their amazement, the bomber remained controllable. This single capability explained a painful mystery. Why so many damaged B-17s, riddled with holes and trailing smoke, still managed to limp back to their bases in England after sustaining combat damage that would have sent any German bombers spiraling to the earth. Throughout the spring of 1943, multiple German pilots put Wulfe Hound through its paces. High-altitude evaluations confirmed it could operate comfortably above 25,000 feet, where German anti-aircraft artillery became progressively less effective. Engine tests revealed sophisticated propeller control systems that reduced pilot workload while maximizing performance. But the most critical tests, the ones that would directly shape Luftwaffe combat doctrine for the remainder of the war, involved its defensive armament. Understanding the B-17's weapons suite became the highest priority for tactical planners. Every German fighter pilot needed to know its blind spots, the safest angles of approach, and the tactics required to survive an encounter with the beast they were now beginning to understand. The entire concept of the B-17 was rooted in a pre-war American air power theory, which held that tightly packed formations of heavy bombers could defend themselves deep inside enemy territory without fighter escort. The key to this theory was overlapping defensive fire. The armament of the B-17 evolved dramatically to meet this need. Early models were fitted with just 5 .50 caliber machine guns, but by the war's end, this number had climbed to a staggering 13. The B-17F model, which Wulfe Hound represented, carried 9 of these heavy Browning M2 machine guns, a concentration of firepower that dwarfed anything in the Luftwaffe's bomber fleet. German pilots quickly gave the B-17 combat box formation a new and evocative nickname: Fliegendes Stachelschwein, the flying porcupine. To understand this defensive matrix from the attacker's perspective, German fighter pilots climbed into their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s and made simulated attack runs on Wulfe Hound. These exercises revealed in stark detail the lethal effectiveness of the bomber's gun positions. The tail position, a powered Cheyenne turret, gave the gunner an excellent unobstructed view and a clear field of fire directly aft, covering the bomber's 6 o'clock with twin .50 caliber guns. An attack from the rear was not just met by the tail gunner, but also by the Sperry dorsal turret, a powered, rotating turret located just behind the cockpit, which could swing its own twin .50s rearward to double the defensive barrage. Side attacks from beam angles were met with a vicious crossfire. The waist gunners, one on each side of the fuselage, stood at open windows manning flexibly mounted .50 caliber machine guns. Their positions were staggered to prevent them from interfering with each other, maximizing their coverage angles. A fighter making a slashing attack from the side would face fire from both waist gunners plus the dorsal turret, which could rotate to engage targets anywhere above the horizontal. The most ingenious and feared defensive position was the Sperry ball turret, slung beneath the bomber's belly. This remarkable piece of engineering was a rotating sphere that provided complete coverage of the lower hemisphere, leaving no blind spots. Inside this cramped globe, a gunner lay in a fetal position, knees drawn up to his chest, his eyes pressed against a computing gun sight. The physical demands of the position were severe. It was too small for the gunner to wear a parachute, too cramped for any significant movement, and he had to endure this claustrophobic confinement for missions that could last 8 hours or more. But its defensive capability was unmatched. Any German pilot attempting to attack from below, a classic tactic against less well-defended bombers, would find themselves tracked with mechanical precision by the ball turret's twin .50s. Through this process of elimination, born from systematic testing and costly combat trials, A new and terrifying doctrine emerged as the only viable option: the frontal attack. The analysis at Rechlin confirmed what some astute German aces like Egon Mayer had already discovered in combat. The B-17F's weakest defensive zone was its nose. It lacked a dedicated power turret, relying instead on flexible .30 or .50 caliber guns mounted in the plexiglass nose cone, operated by the bombardier and navigator, who were not dedicated gunners. Further analysis revealed a critical geometric flaw. The top and ball turrets could not properly lead a target tracking from a high or low 12 o'clock position, creating a significant gap in defensive coverage. Consequently, starting in February 1943, the Luftwaffe began to concentrate its fighter attacks on the lead aircraft of a formation, approaching from this head-on direction. This tactic was an act of extreme, calculated violence, a brutal test of nerve and skill. The German fighter, diving from above and ahead, and the American bomber, flying straight and level, hurtled toward each other at a combined closure speed exceeding 500 miles per hour. That is nearly 750 feet per second. The world for the attacking pilot would shrink to the terrifying image of a four-engine bomber growing in his windscreen, from a distant speck to a monstrous, wing-spanning giant in a matter of seconds. The optimal firing envelope, the window in which his 20mm or 30mm cannons could be effective, lasted perhaps 2 seconds. In that fleeting moment, the pilot had to hold his course directly into the bomber's nose, make his final aiming corrections, fire a concentrated burst, and then execute a violent breakaway maneuver to avoid a fatal collision. The psychological pressure was unimaginable. Many pilots, overcome by the instinct for self-preservation, would break off the attack too early, their shells dissipating harmlessly. Others would fixate on their target, a phenomenon known as target fascination, and forget to break away at all, resulting in horrific mid-air impacts that obliterated both aircraft. Even a successful attack was no guarantee of survival. A wounded B-17 often kept flying, its multiple gunners still firing, its rugged construction absorbing punishment that would have disintegrated other aircraft. But if executed with precision by a pilot of nerves of steel, the head-on pass was devastatingly effective. The tests at Rechlin codified this brutal calculus, transforming it from a desperate improvisation into official Luftwaffe doctrine. Tactical bulletins and training films based on the footage of Wulfe Hound were distributed across the front. The German fighter force was being retrained to fight the B-17, using the knowledge provided by the captured bomber itself. This new knowledge, however, brought little comfort. For the young men of the American 8th Air Force, every mission was a roll of the dice. A tour of duty was initially set at 25 missions. To a civilian, the number sounds small. To a bomber crewman in 1943, it was a lifetime, with loss rates sometimes exceeding 20% on a single raid. The mathematical probability of completing a 25-mission tour was terrifyingly low. They were mostly boys, barely out of their teens, flying for 8 to 10 hours in the unpressurized, unheated fuselage of a B-17, where temperatures at 25,000 feet could plummet to 50 degrees below zero. They endured crippling frostbite, the constant, mind-numbing vibration of the 4 engines, and the ever-present need for clumsy oxygen masks. And then there was fear. The sudden, violent explosion of a flak shell, the sight of a fellow bomber erupting in a fireball, the relentless, terrifying attacks of German fighters. It was a unique form of psychological torture, and yet, every day, they climbed back into their aircraft to do it again. Between May and June of 1943, Wulfe Hound underwent further testing, this time focusing on its Wright Cyclone R-1820 radial engines. Each of the 4 engines produced 1,200 horsepower, giving the bomber a total of 4,800 horsepower. This immense power allowed the 30-ton aircraft to reach speeds near 300 miles per hour and operate at ceilings above 35,000 feet. As German engineers analyzed this performance, their intelligence colleagues were delivering the truly devastating news. Boeing and its subcontractors were producing these complex, powerful aircraft at a rate that exceeded German heavy bomber production by a factor of 10 to 1.
The war in the air had become a war of production, and it was a war Germany was catastrophically losing. The numbers told a story of an industrial imbalance so profound that it rendered tactical considerations almost irrelevant. Between 1935 and 1945, 3 American companies, Boeing in Seattle, Douglas in Long Beach, and the Lockheed subsidiary Vega in Burbank, built a staggering 12,731 B-17 flying fortresses. At the peak of production in 1944, the Boeing plant alone was completing more than 360 B-17s per month. That is more than 12 brand-new 4-engine heavy bombers rolling off a single assembly line every single day. Germany's comparative output was not just smaller, it was pitiful. Their only operational 4-engine heavy bomber was the Heinkel HE-177 Greif. The result of a flawed design requirement that it also be capable of dive bombing, the HE-177 was a notoriously unreliable aircraft, suffering from chronic engine fires that earned it the grim nickname the Flying Lighter. Total production of the HE-177 across all variants between 1942 and 1944 was barely over 1,100 aircraft. In the time it took American factories to build more than 12,000 B-17s, Germany struggled to produce just over 1,000 of its only comparable bomber, an aircraft its own crews feared to fly.
When Luftwaffe pilots learned these production statistics through intelligence briefings, the effect on morale was crippling. What was the point of risking one's life to shoot down one fortress when 10 more would replace it by the next week? The question haunted the fighter squadrons of the Reich. They were trapped in a nightmarish cycle of attrition. Experienced pilots, the aces who had perfected the deadly head-on attack, were a finite resource. By 1944, the average life expectancy of a new German day fighter pilot was measured in weeks. Many were killed on their first or second combat mission before they ever had a chance to learn the hard-won lessons of survival. They were sent up against 1,000-bomber raids, often flying 3 or 4 sorties a day, until they were killed, wounded, or simply collapsed from exhaustion. This stood in stark contrast to the American system, which rotated experienced crews home after their tour of duty to train the next generation, creating an institutional learning process that preserved combat knowledge. Germany could not afford such a luxury. Every experienced pilot had to be kept on the line until the very end. The result was a steady decline in the average skill level of the Luftwaffe, even as the number and quality of the aircraft they faced grew relentlessly. On June 12, 1943, Wulfe Hound was put on public display at an exhibition at Lehr's airfield for high-ranking Luftwaffe commanders and technical specialists.
Alongside the B-17 sat other captured Allied aircraft, a P-47 Thunderbolt, a P-51 Mustang, a British Avro Lancaster, and a de Havilland Mosquito. The display was a sobering gallery of Allied industrial might and technical sophistication. Luftwaffe officers who attended the exhibition came away deeply troubled. One participant later wrote that the contrast between German and American manufacturing quality was immediately apparent. American aircraft components fit together with a precision that German craftsmen, whose own factories were now being staffed with slave labor and constantly disrupted by Allied bombing, could no longer match. The implication was unmistakable. German industry was struggling to produce increasingly obsolete designs, while American factories were churning out superior equipment in overwhelming quantities. After the exhibition, the captured bomber was used in one final test program at Rechlin. Engineers equipped it with glider towing apparatus to evaluate its suitability for transport operations, a role for which its 4 powerful engines were well suited. The tests were successful, but Germany's glider forces were already in decline after suffering catastrophic losses in Crete and other theaters. The practical application of these tests was limited. In September 1943, Wulfe Hound's life as a test subject came to an end. It was transferred from the clinical environment of Rechlin to the shadowy world of one of the Luftwaffe's most secretive units, I.Kampfgeschwader 200. Operating from Rangsdorf Airfield near Berlin, KG-200 was a special operations wing like no other, officially formed in February 1944 under the command of Oberst Heinrich Heigl. Its mission portfolio included long-range reconnaissance, the insertion and extraction of spies behind enemy lines, and supply drops to cut off German forces. The unit was so secretive that its former commander, the famous bomber ace Werner Bombach, completely omitted any mention of it from his post-war autobiography. KG-200 flew an eclectic collection of captured Allied aircraft, chosen because they often had superior range and load-carrying abilities compared to available German aircraft. These captured B-17s were considered so secret that they were sometimes given the cover designations Dornier Do 200 or Do 288.
At Rangsdorf, Wulfe Hound received a new paint scheme, a dark camouflage of blues and grays designed for night operations. It was assigned the KG-200 side code A3 plus AE. Its new life was one of clandestine missions, flying under the cover of darkness deep into Allied-controlled territory. A lone B-17 flying at night or in poor weather could be mistaken by Allied radar operators for a friendly bomber returning from a mission, allowing it to penetrate enemy airspace unchallenged. The deception could buy the precious time needed for a successful spy drop or reconnaissance run. The detailed operational records of Wulfe Hound's service with KG-200 are lost to history, but post-war research has pieced together a picture of its audacious and varied missions. The captured bombers were used as long-range transports to supply secret airstrips in the Middle East and North Africa. In one of its first known clandestine missions, part of Operation Etapin Haze, Wulfe Hound flew from Marseille to Libya, carrying Arab agents who had been trained in Berlin to establish an intelligence network codenamed Traviata. Other missions were less successful. On April 16, 1944, another KG-200 B-17, low on fuel and with its pilot, Oberlieutenant Dumke, slightly injured, was forced to ditch in the Bay of Kalamata in Greece. On June 27, 1944, a B-17G on a mission for Commando Ogla developed a fuel leak and was forced to land at a Spanish airfield in Valencia, where the plane was impounded and its SS agent passengers spirited away by their escort. Perhaps the most dangerous missions involved dropping agents deep into Soviet territory. In December 1944, a KG-200 B-17 flew a perilous mission from Krakow to drop 6 Soviet agents near Odessa. During the flight, one of the agents attempted to throw a hand grenade inside the aircraft, but a quick-thinking German gunner managed to jettison it before it could detonate. The incident led to a grim new procedure. Subsequent Russian agents were often rendered unconscious before being unceremoniously jettisoned over their target zone. It was also alleged that the captured bombers were used as Trojan horses, flying in full Luftwaffe markings to shadow 8th Air Force bomber formations, providing a constant stream of radio updates on their altitude and heading to German fighter controllers. American air crews eventually grew wise to this tactic, developing procedures to fire upon any stranger attempting to join their formation. Even as Wulfe Hound was flying these secret missions, the lessons it had taught the Luftwaffe were being put into practice and countered in the skies over Germany. The Americans, learning from their own brutal combat experience, were continuously improving their bombers. The B-17G model, which began entering service in the fall of 1943, featured a crucial addition: a remotely operated, hydraulically powered Bendix chin turret mounted under the nose, equipped with 2 more .50 caliber machine guns. This new weapon was a direct counter to the head-on attack tactic that the Germans had perfected. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe's preferred method of attack became far more dangerous. A B-17G could now bring 6 to 8 heavy machine guns to bear on a frontal attacker.
This technological evolution was matched by a tactical one that would permanently alter the air war. The arrival of long-range American escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, spelled the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe. Equipped with drop tanks, the P-51 had the range to accompany the bomber formations all the way to their targets deep inside Germany and back again. The German fighter pilots, who had previously been able to attack the bombers with impunity once their short-range escorts had to turn back, now found themselves embroiled in vicious dogfights from the moment they took off. The Little Friends, as the bomber crews called them, were not just a defensive shield. They went on the offensive, actively hunting Luftwaffe fighters and strafing their airfields. The combination of the B-17's own formidable defensive firepower and a swarm of dedicated escort fighters broke the back of the German fighter force. The end for Wulfe Hound, the aircraft that had started it all, came on April 10, 1945. By then, it had served the German war effort for nearly 2.5 years. It was parked at Oranienburg airfield when it was destroyed during an American air raid, a victim of the very same strategic bombing campaign it had been captured to counter. A reconnaissance photo taken 4 days later showed its wreckage still sitting at the corner of the airfield. The captured bomber had become a symbol of the futility of Germany's struggle. It had provided invaluable tactical lessons, but it had also revealed a strategic truth that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. You cannot defeat an enemy who can build bombers faster than you can shoot them down. The real secret weapon of the American air campaign was not the 13 machine guns mounted on a B-17G. It was the economic and industrial system that could design, manufacture, and deploy over 12,000 of them, while simultaneously building hundreds of thousands of other aircraft, tanks, and ships needed to fight a global war. The German test pilots who flew Wulfe Hound at Rechlin came away with a grudging respect for American engineering. But what they were truly witnessing was the awesome power of American industrial civilization, an arsenal of democracy that, once fully mobilized, proved to be unstoppable. The mathematics of material production had predicted Germany's defeat with absolute certainty. The captured B-17 had simply delivered the message.